Now, to understand more on this subject and the key question of what can be done, I'm joined this evening by Gurucharan, economist and author. I'm also speaking with Rohit Azad, economist. Welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for joining us on Beyond the Headlines this evening as we tackle the inflation issue. Mr. Das, your thoughts first. This is just a one-way street. It's happening all around the world, but the key concern with India is that when food inflation spikes, a large number of people, a large part of this population gets hit very immediately and very personally. How do we tackle that?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's inflation. Inflation is a bad thing. But the sad news is that there are very limited things that governments can do. In a market economy, which is connected with the world, really, the fact is that there are, in India, of course, as you know, elections are won and lost on inflation. And so Mr. Modi should be a very worried man right now. Although his record of the last 7 years actually is pretty good on inflation. In fact, they were able to control in the last few years of the UPA, if you remember before 2014, inflation had spiked up. And this was one of the reasons that commentators gave and economists gave for his winning the election. Anyway, right now, the reality is that the causes of the inflation are mostly external. It is the war. So you can say it's Russia's fault for invading Ukraine, or you can, and that has spiked the oil, petroleum prices have gone up, and it has also harmed the other commodities.
Right.
And so, as you explained very well, the edible oils which India imports have been hurt. So these are really, I would say, these are non-controllable factors. And they've calculated that a $10 increase in the price of oil.
So your contention, Mr. Das, So your contention, essentially, Mr. Das, is that nothing can be done. It's inevitable. We have to grin and bear it, in a sense. Let me go across to Rohit Azad and see if he agrees with that point of view. So,
I'm saying not entirely, because the government can cut duties in the short term on these imported items. The petroleum duties government could have done more in reducing the price of petroleum. That is, the state governments control that to a great extent. And it could have also done more to cut the duty on imported edible oil, which are the two of the biggest factors. But yes, you're right. Overall, it is the government's role is limited, and people just need to appreciate that.
No, that's not what I'm saying, sir. That's what you are saying. That's not what I'm saying. That's what you are saying. You're saying the government's role is limited. There are a lot of external factors.
Yes.
I want to bring Rohit Azad in with a couple of clear questions. For one, did we not see this coming? And I ask this even in the context of the out-of-cycle rate hike that the RBI put in place. They themselves and a lot of forecasters were taken by surprise with how high the March inflation figures are. April numbers are even worse. So A, did we not see this coming? Did we not anticipate that the high taxes that central and state governments charge on fuel will eventually come to bite us? We know that this war has been going on for about 60 days now. So was this completely unexpected?
No, absolutely not. I think this was expected. You already knew that the crude oil prices are going to go up. So that is definitely a source of inflation which is coming from outside. But additionally, you also have rupee falling. So there are multiple reasons for why inflation is taking place. One is, of course, imported, as Mr. Das said, that is not something in your control. But there are many other things which are in your control. Number one is the tax that you impose on it. If you look at the taxes that the government currently imposes, the central government, I'm not even talking about the state government. In fact, state government taxes have pretty much remained the same if you look at the data. For the central government, the taxes, which were about 10 rupees per liter of petrol, they are 30 currently, 27.9 to be precise. Now, that's a 3-time jump from 2014 to now. That is something which you could have easily brought down. Oil, as you correctly said, is a commodity which goes into production of every other commodity, right? It's a necessary commodity for transport reasons, directly, indirectly, it goes into production of other commodities. So it's not surprising that you see the inflation of the kind that we see today. Part of it is something which is imported, as I said, but part is actually the government trying to in the name of tax collection, it's basically imposing this burden on the common people. It's easy for me or you or Mr. Das to say that they should appreciate what the government can or cannot do. But for those people who have to miss their meals as a result of this rising inflation with their incomes constant, it's a huge toll. It is the responsibility of the government to ensure whatever way in which it can keep the prices down is a responsibility of any government. I mean, we would have said a similar thing when this kind of inflation was taking place during the UPA government.
Sure.
If we would say it then, we should say it now as well.
No, so I want to understand what exactly governments can do. I want to understand what exactly governments can do. Let me come to you, Mr. Gurucharan. So there's two sides of this, of course. There's their fiscal. I'll come back to you, Mr. Azad. One minute. There are two sides to this, right? So there can be fiscal measures that, say, the government can take. There can be monetary measures that the Reserve Bank can come in. The first salvo of sorts has been fired by the Reserve Bank. They've hiked rates. For starters, more rate hikes could be expected. But what can be done on the fiscal side?
Yeah, well, you mentioned them, Tamanna, very well, both on the fiscal and monetary side. Governments try to do these things. But let's appreciate the big picture. This is around the world happening. I'm right now in Oxford, England, and I met some people last night, and they said that they have become poor, and the inflation has hit much worse the average person in the UK than in India. And what I'm trying to say is, yes, we voters, we always expect the government to do this, to do that. But it is also important to realize that there are limits to what the government can do. And you cannot, to blame the government, every government, for something like this. I mean, onion prices, you remember elections were lost in India because of onion prices. And that is just, and you know what happens actually? There's a damage we do to farmers because what happens is that...
Sir, look at what's happening in neighboring Sri Lanka because of an economic crisis. I think there is just no way to de-link. There's no way to de-link politics from economics, sir. Just that humble submission.
Yeah, but let me just add this to you, that when governments try to control inflation, they can do a lot of damage also. And the damage is done typically to the farmers, because when prices go up, India stops the export of many of its goods. And therefore, for the first time, I mean, why were the farmers' protests? One of the reasons for farmer protests was precisely a policy, which is a policy of stop and start on exports of our commodities. Just when the farmer begins to see the possibility of making some money, we close it down in the interest of the consumer. So there is, I mean, half the population of India, it depends on agriculture. And what we do is our policy on inflation, controlling inflation, actually hurts half of India. So let's appreciate the fact that we cannot do in a democracy, a government often does harm in taking steps And these populist steps of giving away free this and free that, that's not a responsible behavior of governments. You know, governments get elected because they say, we'll give you electricity at half the price.
Okay, that's
You know
that's
that.
an important point. Let me just get a response to that, because you've talked about 2 or 3 things, Mr. Das. Let me get a response to that. So you're saying let's not go overboard, where you rack up more debt, you weaken the Indian economy. I understand that point, and this is, you know, a long-lasting debate. Mr. Rohit Azad, just your response to this. Is there a limitation to what the governments can do? How can the most vulnerable be protected? And the point that Mr. Gurucharan Das was making, when prices go up, it's actually good for rural India, at least for farmers.
No, absolutely not. I would disagree. See, if the prices go up and the prices go in the hands of those who are producing it, that's one thing. But if it is essentially taxes for which the prices are going up, then that money is going in the hands of the government, not necessarily of the farmers. That's point number one. Point number two, a large majority, which I'm sure Mr. Das knows, a large majority of our farming community itself is net buyer of goods, not net sellers. If that is the case, so if you leave aside the big farmers, and if you're a net buyer, then a price rise actually affects you. Affects you negatively, because you're actually purchasing. So how much ever you're producing, you're actually buying more. That's why I'm saying net buyer. In which case you don't gain. Even that section that he's talking about doesn't gain necessarily from inflation, even if the prices were completely to percolate down to the producers, which they don't. That's number one. Number two, it's easy for us to say, as I said, sitting in the room that I am, or the news studio that you're sitting in, or Mr. Das, for whom the incomes are actually indexed to inflation. For example, I will actually be getting a dearness allowance as a response to the high increase in inflation. A similar thing will be happening in the first world countries. For them, it is not really an inflation because the real incomes are basically remaining fixed. But for the poorer sections of the population whose incomes are not indexed to inflation, it is they who have to take the hit. It is they whose income actually get decreased in the process. So this assumption that one is making that you have the same thing as in the first world as in the third, it's not. I mean, more than 92% of your population doesn't have their wages indexed to inflation. So they are the ones who...
Before I wrap, Mr. Das, you want to respond to that? I think that comment is in response to what you said, that you believe the average Britisher is facing more trouble than the average Indian right now due to inflation. Do you stand by that comment?
I do stand by that comment, because you are seeing the kind of the price increases on just the heating of homes that they have. This particular person's home, he was spending £200 before this crisis, and now he's spending £700. And this has driven him to distraction. He can't afford it. And look, it's not fair to compare rich and poor. It's always very easy to say, I'm a bleeding heart and I love the poor and I'm going to do everything for the poor. Sure. But let's accept one thing, a certain amount of humility, that if we accept the market economy, we have to accept that prices will go up and down. That government, it's not a command economy. Or we can go back to the pre-91 days. We can go back to finding the Soviet Union, living in the Soviet Union. That's not the kind of life we want to lead. And so I'm just saying the government has to have humility, and the voter and the citizens have to have humility, that there's a lot that we can't control. And one of the things is, in a market, the price is not determined by the government. It's determined by the market. Now, the government can do things like reduce taxes, etc., as Mr. Azad has pointed out, is absolutely right.
Well,
but
you know, even if I will have to wrap this here. I hope viewers can draw their own conclusions from this conversation. We've presented to you two disparate points of view on how inflation can be tackled. I'm sure any government will have in its mind the primary responsibility of making sure people don't go hungry because of high prices. And here is where our system that we developed during COVID-19 can perhaps come into use, can be expanded while making sure that the economy stays stable. I want to thank both of you for joining us on this leg of the show and on the lead story that we are tackling tonight.